are going to hear today from Ari Feldman, who is the VP of Global Compliance and Strategy at Medidata. Ari's been a longtime supporter, and Medidata has been as well. So Ari is going to give a short presentation on the topic, which is tech-enabled clinical trials. And then we're going to have a discussion, and I really mean a discussion. It's truly meant to be interactive. This is meant to be like interesting and fun, instructive for you. So sometimes people get a little bit nervous asking questions, which is fine. But you know, either raise your hand or maybe better put it in the chat box, and then once we open it to Q&A and discussion, I'll just try and call on folks. So with that, Ari, as I said, has been at Medidata as VP Global Compliance and Strategy for 4 years. Prior to that, he was at PwC for 16 years. And he is an expert in this area, which is why we are excited to have him talk about it. There's obviously a lot going on in this area. So thank you again. I'm going to turn it over to you, Ari, and look forward to the discussion.
So thanks for that intro. As Bunny said, you know, I've been at Medidata for just coming on 4 years. And prior to that, I grew up at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and my background is really in governance, risk, and controls. And so I look at pharmaceuticals, I look at the clinical trial landscape, the health sciences landscape, not necessarily from an industry veteran perspective who's worked in the big pharma space, but really from controls and what is it about the pharma space where there's a lot of hesitancy. That we know that it's a very regulated environment. And as Bunny said, I spent my time at PwC, and I've really been across a variety of industries. And perhaps my view on the life sciences space is quite, I'll call it, colored by my experiences across other industries. And so I look towards regulation as not a necessary evil, but when you have that regulation and you have to put the controls around it, how do you look towards leveraging those controls to further and better business? And so in coming on to this chat today, by the way, it's meant to be just that, a chat. So Anand and Bunny can monitor the chat room, and if there's something that you've got, you can raise your hand virtually or I don't know, wave at your video, and I'll gladly stop. There's obviously dedicated.
Put it in chat.
Okay, cool. There's and stop me, Bunny, because I got too many things going on here. So there's obviously going to be dedicated Q&A time at the end. So without further ado, today's topic really speaks to itself. Tech-enabled clinical trials, will recent regulatory changes take? And I'd like to start here with some numbers. So this is the numbers on the left were from a study that was published by the CDC and talks about hospital room emergencies. And these slides will be circulated, and you can see the reference link. So you see that they were talking about 3 major conditions, well-known conditions, and they were talking about reduction in emergency room visits during a 10-week period since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I found this to be quite interesting because obviously there's a reduction in visits. What's driving at this? And concurrently, when you look on the right, Medidata has done a study based on data, because we're based on the data of studies within our platform, we can tell the reduction in new subject enrollment within a clinical trial, and you can see that that's down 30%. And so, what's driving these numbers down? We can possibly say that people are afraid to go to hospitals, or afraid to leave their house, they're afraid of the pandemic. But what I found starkly in contrast was when you look at these 3 conditions on the left, the number of ER visits or hospital visits, and by the way, that was based on ICD codes. So, obviously it's not a perfect number, but again, directionally, I think it's probably accurate. And the diabetic related emergencies didn't have as much of a reduction. And perhaps the reason for this is that the signs and symptoms for heart attacks and strokes very much mirror that of what we've seen with COVID. I mean, they've basically said every condition, every sign and symptom can be COVID, shortness of breath, diaphoresis, high, elevated pulse, fever, etc. But when you look at diabetes, those are patients that have technology and tools at their fingertips and are acutely aware of the conditions which would require a hospital visit. And so perhaps what we're seeing here is where technology has played a role. That is to say, you have basic things like a blood glucose meter, where which is a device and has software on it, which is considered to be a device. So by all intents and purposes, it's a piece of technology. Those patients are able to kind of watch what's going on and drive their, and not be necessarily afraid to go to the hospital because they know that they need to go. So what I see in here is this further underscores the need to have technology-enabled clinical trials, because if we have the ability to, within the clinical trial ecosystem, to work with patients in a remote perspective, not necessarily on site, and not necessarily with direct monitoring, et cetera. And I'll come on to a few examples shortly. Perhaps that will help the clinical trial landscape. So, taking it forward, what's the regulatory perspective? So we're clearly working in a disconnected global landscape. There's clear lack of harmonization on the regulatory requirements. So interestingly, the European Union recently released a pharmaceutical strategy document, and Medidata and some of the folks on my team participated in a workshop held by the European Commission. And the EU in and of itself recognizes that it is lagging in terms of technology and clinical trials, and that there's lessons to be learned from COVID-19. Now, on the stark contrast to that, the EMA, when they put out their guidance, said their guidance ends when the COVID-19 pandemic ends. So I don't know how those two reconcile with one another, but you've got the EU saying one thing and the EMA saying, the EC saying one thing and the EMA saying another thing. Not a surprise. So there is an acknowledgement within that pharmaceutical strategy document that science and technology need to be embraced with a patient-centered focus. And there is also a consensus within that document that there's a need to redraft regulatory frameworks to accelerate drug development, despite the fact that the EU and everyone, I think that's sort of a given, remains very fragmented in their approach. And by contrast to the EU, you've got the FDA, who departed from their normal process of issuing a draft guidance, having a comment period, and then drafting, sending out their guidance. They issued their guidance. They said, we know we didn't do a draft period. We want your feedback and we'll keep redrafting. And I've counted no fewer than 6 times over the course of a 4-month period that that there was a response to industry feedback and tweaking both their guidance as well as adding Q&A to it. So just taking practically how we see a fragmented approach. So within the EU, we know there's a fragmented approach. Let me just kind of draw a contrast between, let's say, what's happening in the US and what's happening in the EU. And similarly, I just use those two as an example. Similarly in Asia, whether it be Japan, China, Singapore, et cetera. If we think about basic things such as informed consent, the FDA has provided a clear path to its use. The EU has said, we approve of it, but you should work within national provisions and within the national legal framework, and then goes ahead and acknowledges that national provisions and approaches differ. We've done, at Medidata, we've done an analysis. We didn't just do an analysis. We reached out to almost every country within the European Union to get a regulatory statement on electronic informed consent, and it's incredible how disparate it is in terms of what it can be used for, which frankly is quite limited, and who and which organizations, you know, sort of which countries do allow it, save for the UK, which I know is not part of the EU anymore. Save for the UK, it's really not an accepted practice, sort of globally within the EU. So, what are the technology opportunities? But before I go forward, what is certainly acknowledged in every regulatory document that I've seen is 2 points. There's absolutely universal agreement. One is that patient safety remains paramount, undoubtedly, right? Patient safety is at the forefront. And with regard to clinical trials, reasonable steps should be taken to avoid halting clinical trials, as there remains a need for patients to receive critical treatments. So we've got these two, what I view as sort of cornerstones. They are absolutely critical points. But then when you get down into the practicality, whether it be because of force from industry or a force from regulatory agencies, we don't see as much wide adoption as one would think. So let's look at the technology side of things. So I mentioned my background in governance, risk, and controls, and the way I look at that, and what the way I've practiced at Medidata and kind of move forward in the business is, we're not going to wait for regulators to issue guidance. We're going to let the data lead and make decisions based on that using a true risk-based approach. A good example of that is, you know, sort of, and I hate to use buzz terms, but sort of this idea of real-world evidence. I do think that there is a huge future in that. I think that what I've seen from some of our clients, what I've heard at various engagements with regulators is, there's a lot of waiting for guidance. There is also a lot of moving forward, but there's a lot of waiting for guidance. And I don't think we're going to see sort of clear guidance, and there's going to be lots of questions. And what's the wait? I think, and the approach that we've taken is, let's look at what makes sense, and let's go with the rebuttable presumption that if you can put in a framework and you can manage the risk accordingly, whether it be around consent, whether it be around monitoring, whether it be around drug supply, then technology can certainly lead. And we can move away from a risk aversion approach where all areas of a clinical trial, and I use clinical trial as an example, but it's really anything in the health and life sciences space, where all those areas are taken equally, whether it, you know, and I don't view all of those areas to be equal, right? The impact of incorrect drug supply is going to be on a patient, and patient safety is going to be, and advancement of perhaps curing diseases is going to be very different than someone not signing off on a document in a timely manner, but everything in the content of it was done on time. So let's look at the tech side. I want to highlight 4 areas where the regulatory easing, and I'm using that term very specifically with regard to COVID, has proven to be very effective for clinical trials. And I know the topic is what will stick. If I had that answer, if I knew that answer, if I knew which technology would lead, if I knew which solution would lead in terms of these areas, and this is just 4 examples, like we can go on and on, right? I'm sure everyone on the phone has examples that they can provide. I don't know what's going to stick, but something has to stick because the data stands for itself, right? So let's take site visits. There is a long-standing practice that you need to go to a site to complete a form. and now there is pretty much wide acceptance to complete forms with electronic collection. Because the agencies, the authorities have recognized that people need to be in quarantine. They might actually be in quarantine in a hospital. And so to be in quarantine in a hospital and not be able to administer a clinical trial, and that hospital in theory could even be a site. So to have a patient who's part of a trial, who's in quarantine in a hospital for COVID and not receive medication because we can't do, they can't get to the site in the traditional way. Site visits can now be done sort of remotely, and we've seen telemedicine kick in there, and we've also seen, frankly, telemedicine kick in on the clinical side as well. I know at first, for example, insurers weren't going to pay to the same rates, and then I think they did, and then they changed it. And there's been, I actually just saw a headline last night that I think there's some sort of executive order that was on the table around telehealth. Not for clinical trials per se, but for clinical. And again, I think that's something that we're seeing change dramatically. Another area, so the next area here is monitoring. Source data review has been a hot topic within clinical trial ecosystems forever. And whether it can be performed, whether and how it can be performed effectively via remote solution has long been a debate. And so, like in this example, Medidata has introduced a remote source document review solution, which it's regulatorily compliant. It de-identifies, it manages and reviews, enables someone to review critical study documents. So here's a case of where monitoring has really shifted the paradigm from sort of 100% to really taking on a risk-based approach. And if I zoom out for a second here, and I just talk about risk-based approach, I see that in everything that I do, in every interaction that I have with Medidata's customer base. I can see firsthand the difference in risk tolerance from not just one company to another, but within the companies themselves, right? So your clinical data managers might take a different view than your procurement team or than your business ops team, just because of history and what they're looking towards. So and frankly, this is not something, I was servicing the financial services industry at the time of Sarbanes-Oxley, when Sarbanes-Oxley came around, and that was the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation was the result of sort of the Enrons of the world, where there was financial fraud committed, and this was meant to introduce some financial oversight. And this risk aversion or approach to risk, I should say, is not new. I saw it then, and so to see it now is not a surprise. The question is, has COVID caused enough of a stir, both within the regulatory authorities as well as, more importantly, within industry, to drive change? I mentioned consent. I'll touch on it again briefly. It's never been easier than it is today with remote collection of data. You can use an impartial witness, and even though electronic informed consent in its full has not been kind of allowed within the EU's sort of remit, they have allowed certain things to take place in terms of having an impartial witness, sending an email, faxing, etc. Who knew that in 2020 someone was going to actually reference facsimile as a means of communicating? But hey, I still have one in my house. I still use it, and I guess it's come in handy a few times as I've been home. And then the last area to me is probably the most fascinating in terms of drug supply. Drugs historically for clinical trials were sent to sites to administer to patients, and now what we're seeing is the drug supply can be sent directly to the patient. Parenthetically, in all these cases, and this is no exception, Medidata's systems have been retooled to enable direct-to-patient shipments. So I think we've seen industry drive, we've seen regulators come out with need for change, and we've seen industry, based on their questions, drive changes to the way they're doing things. This has gone all the way from protocol revisions, the way adverse events are reported, and of course drug supply. So I'll just, a lot of what I said, and I think Bunny and Anand had sent this out beforehand, we're now on version 7.0, and I think 8.0 is due to be released soon of the Medidata perspective. I find this to be quite an interesting read. It talks about not just, it gives a very well-rounded approach, including the regulatory, but also has some very interesting and fascinating data that keeps getting updated related to study enrollment and clinical trials and how sort of the curves have gone globally. And also, of course, talks about some of the, it introduces some of the ideas of where technology can play a critical role in addressing changes to ongoing or starting new trials. And the right, that's Medidata's blog. That's a link to Medidata's blog where myself and my extended team have been keeping an update. It's quite a challenge as the agencies, as the authorities come out with new guidance to kind of sift through it, find out what that is, and then make those updates. So we've been keeping that updated. It does give a global viewpoint to the extent that that's reasonable and possible. It doesn't go to every single country. I think we kept it to the G20, if I'm not mistaken. It has been a challenge because like when the FDA comes out with their guidance, they don't say what's changed. They just sort of make the change, and you've got to compare. You've got to figure out how to do a red line from one to the other. So I find we've gotten a lot of positive feedback on both of these documents, particularly as I interface with both the business side as well as the quality and regulatory folks. Just on the regulatory position. So
hey, Ari.
Yeah.
It says Geeks Talk Clinical. You're not a geek.
I didn't name the blog. I suspect that was something that dates back to Glenn and team, but that's Medidata's blog. It's called Geeks Talk Clinical.
Yeah.
Plenty of people think I'm a geek. I don't have any chest pockets, so there's no pocket protector today, but maybe I would have put one on. You've
given a great overview, and we did send the resources out. Maybe we can start opening it up to discussion and Q&A. I know, Terrence, you just posted a question, so why don't you unmute yourself and ask it?
Sure, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Yeah, we can. I mean, again, I'm just going to stress, if people would put their video on, if you can, it's a lot more interesting, but if you can't, that's fine. So go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna put it on here. Don't be startled.
Yeah, there we go.
So hi, Ari, thank you for this. This is really helpful. And so, you mentioned a lot about regulation, and you did also mention those other 4 areas that you see as opportunities. So, in a simplistic form, for those that participate in clinical trials, the key challenge is convenience, right? Being able to get to wherever the clinical trial sites are. And then on the other side, it's those that with remote, being able to control the patients, whether they're taking the medication and doing measurements and so forth. So how do we achieve both of those, both the convenience, so more people are participating in clinical trials because why not? It's something that's easier to do, but also it doesn't negatively impact the results because they are still a controlled environment or controlled setting.
Yeah, so it's a question we get regularly. I think it's there's so much. So when I look at technology, I think technology comes under, I'll put 2 parts to it, right? Technology, there's going to be certain regulated technologies, such as things like a blood glucose meter. That's a regulated technology. And then there's other technologies like, that are not necessarily commercial grade or not necessarily regulated, but can be used to kind of watch in the environment. So for example, you could very easily enable a video chat, well, and watch someone take their blood pressure, right? So you've shipped them we're not even asking them, if you want to even zoom that out and say, I'm not even asking you to go to CVS and buy a blood pressure cuff. I'm going to ship you a blood pressure cuff, right? One that's acceptable for you to use. And I can even watch you taking your blood pressure, and I can even read that blood pressure, right? So, so let me just call them some of my personal experience. And I don't share this too widely, but for the past 25 plus years, I've been an emergency medical technician in New York State. And so I ride ambulances all the time. As a volunteer, I do it for fun. You can very easily tell patients that really know what they're doing from what they're kind of a little more clueless and need a little more assistance and guidance. And I think that that's probably evident at sites as well. If we can harness that information and say, you know what, we know this patient might need a little bit more hand-holding or watching or whatever versus this patient, you can take, I think, Terrence, it's reasonable to start taking a risk-based approach to saying, okay, this person has had this disease for this number of years, they're under control. We might need to, maybe the level of monitoring and how we're looking at that is going to, I don't use monitoring with a capital M, but sort of oversight, right, might be different than this patient who's just recently diagnosed or who is in a category where using a tablet might be more difficult or the like. So I do think that those two can very easily be married up. That said, I don't think that technology will totally replace the need for certain things to take place in person. Right. I mean, I think that's probably where we're headed. That's where my children or grandchildren will be at. But I don't think that that's where we're at today. I think that there is an absolute opportunity to start infiltrating more of these types of things into the sort of the day-to-day interactions.
Can I do a quick follow?
Yeah, sure.
So do you agree, Ari, with my statement that it is convenience? I was just thinking as you were answering that to some extent it's awareness. Like I can't tell you how many people I've heard who maybe had COVID and recovered who said, I would happily be part of a clinical trial. But they're not going out there and looking for it. They don't know about trials that are happening. Do you think there's also an awareness piece that is really important or other factors that besides convenience and awareness?
I do think, so when I joined Medidata, I was actually surprised by the fact that awareness of clinical trial, that one of the major issues in clinical trials is enrollment, right? Identifying patients and enrolling them. And when you start to kind of peel that away, there's other reasons why people might not be aware of a clinical trial, but I do think it is convenience, right? If someone who is is an oncology patient and they need to go to a site, I take it for granted that I live in the Metro New York area and there's probably sites for most clinical trials within a relatively short radius to my house. But for majority of people, that's not the case, right? So I do think that one is the awareness, and two is if I'm a physician in some rural area, I don't think it's going to be feasible for this relatively sick patient to get to a site. So I'm not even going to tell my patient about it, right? And I might, as a physician, I might not be aware of it. So awareness is certainly an issue, but I don't think, Terrence, that that's not an issue that necessarily technology is solving. I think that with technology, on the backside of that will come the increased, the opportunity for increased awareness. Because if I don't have to go to a site, if I don't have to leave my house for a lot of, activities that I could otherwise do within my own home, right? And even in clinical, right? People are now getting physical therapy with telemedicine visits, right? I mean, things that, one would have thought they have to be in the therapist's office, et cetera. So I do think those two are connected. I just don't think that one is going to drive that there's a direct correlation between the two.
Okay.
If you don't mind me jumping in a little bit here, I've had some experience in this area, and I've seen a couple of situations where technology has made a big difference in identifying and recruiting patients. I worked with Mayo Clinic, and using electronic medical records systems, we were able to pre-screen, pre-identify patients so that physicians, when they are meeting with their patients, can evaluate whether or not a particular study or a group of studies might make sense for that patient. Which brings me to the next point, and that is, in my experience, one of the, if not the most important aspects of recruiting patients into study is the physician, him or herself. The relationship with that physician is the number one reason why an individual will go into a study. There are a couple of outliers. There's some smoking cessation, et cetera, which people are constantly looking for ways to sort of enroll in studies and find a way to break those habits. But generally speaking, overwhelming evidence shows that a relationship between the patient and the physician, the physician is the sole or primary reason why the patient will enroll in a study.
I would agree. Makes sense. You know, and you know, Gary, on that point, the continued care, right? Does me enrolling in a clinical trial mean that my physician, whom I've had a relationship with for and who I trust, et cetera, does that mean that physician's going to cease to have sort of general oversight, right? Am I going under someone else's care? So I do believe relationships are absolutely key. And I do think, again, technology has an opportunity to play here. What again remains to be seen is how much of this is there going to be a view that we're seeing like in EMEA where there's a clear statement of our guidance ceases to be effective once the pandemic is declared over. And that view I think could also very well change.
Hey, thanks, Gary. Good to see you. Ivor, you've been posting furiously. This is great.
I can't keep up here.
No. Well, Ivor, you gotta unmute him.
No, can you hear me?
Great.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah,
we can
I
hear
see
you.
your statement. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, wait, let him talk. Let him say it.
So the two, well, one comment I think was already mostly commented on. I'm just thinking about what about 5 years from now? Where's the horizon over the horizon that we could be thinking about now, especially if this pandemic goes on?
We're having trouble hearing you, I think.
Okay, I don't.
That's great. That's
if
better.
we can. So I'm thinking about what's the horizon, what's just over the horizon that is in the next few years, such as augmented reality and that sort of things. Very rich sensor data, streams of sensor data that would be subject to machine learning or AI. These things are obviously somewhat in the future, but someone's working on them, they have to be. And then this physiotherapy question, some of the virtual physiotherapy companies are like the virtual version of in-person physiotherapy without all the diathermy and machines and everything. And others are experimenting with putting sensors on the patient's body. I think Hinge Health might be one of them, and Sword Health maybe is another. There's probably a couple of them. And then not only can the actual real physiotherapist analyze the patient's movements, but an AI probably could be helping them do that. I don't know if an AI is helping them do that, but it could be. And so if you're doing physiotherapy is like all over the map in terms of maybe it prevents things and surgeries, and maybe it doesn't. Well, maybe the variation is more in how it's done and what the patient is doing and how engaged they are than it is in physiotherapy, because it's not like taking a statin, where it's either once you've taken it, it's going to do whatever it does biologically. You need a lot more engagement in these kinds of things. Thoughts?
A lot there. Sensors is a big topic. So I don't know that I could say what's in the longer term horizon, other than that just the way the world is going. I could definitely see, you've seen big commercial players come out with more and more sensors and data that are available to folks. The question is, to individuals, the question is whether that will be accepted whether that data will be acceptable within the clinical trial space. I think that's only a matter of time. So longer term, absolutely. In my view, it's inevitable, right? There's more data available to individuals and for analysis being produced every second of the day than there has ever been globally. sensors is a place where Medidata focuses as well, and incorporating sensors into the clinical trial specifically. So I think that sensors absolutely has a future. Again, it goes back to a big future. I think it goes back to what is going to be the what's going to be the acceptable technology that can be used for said sensors. And there's a push and pull here. So I was in a meeting with Scott Gottlieb, Dr. Scott Gottlieb. It was right after he had tendered his resignation as the commissioner of the FDA. So he was still officially in office, but he had just tendered his resignation. So I guess he could speak a little unfettered. And there was some industry folks in the room, and he was positing, so obviously the industry folks were positing we need more clarification from the agency as to what is and what is not, sort of the guidelines. And he was positing, well, we'd like to see industry come forward. We've given frameworks, not prescriptive guidelines. We'd like to see industry come forward with some ideas, and then we can have a dialogue about acceptability and plans, et cetera. So you can see there's this push and this pull, and although that was a one-to-one, I think it's probably from our experience, just that's the case all over the world. I'll reference, Bunny, if I may, a recent interaction we had with the Singapore HSA, the health authority in Singapore. They really weren't aware of the power of electronic informed consent. And the ability to use a tablet and what that means and how that would impact. So just some of it, and I go back to Terrence, your comment of just awareness. Patients might not be aware, physicians might not be aware, and regulators alike might not be aware. So.
And then we're going to have to be the leaders here.
100%, I agree.
Hi.
Hey, Ashish?
Yes,
Yeah.
hi.
Great. Hey, how are you?
Good.
Actually, you know what would help everybody? I forgot to say. Introduce yourself and what's your relationship here?
So I run a healthcare AI startup here in Princeton, and we primarily focused until COVID on helping analyze and build AI algorithms for surgical procedures, orthopedic, cardiovascular, and so on and so forth. Since COVID, surprisingly, I got a lot more requests from pharma companies, naturally. And we did onboard our first CRO for running, I wouldn't call it tech-enabled, but more like remote data monitoring clinical trial for pulmonary diseases. The part which was very difficult to implement was getting past the regulatory. And I would like to chat with some experts offline on that. But the biggest hurdle once we passed the regulatory piece was actually bringing technology in the implementation. So the doctors were not ready for a newer technology. The patients it was very difficult to train them once the technology was built in, because they have to capture the data. And it was a big, big eye-opener for both the CRO and the sponsor, because it cost them a lot of money and they just did not plan for that at all. So my question is, these are going to be real practical challenges for just about everybody, physicians, patients, sponsors, sites. And are these big challenges being accounted as part of the planning itself? Because they're not part of the regulation. Nobody cares about what the patient does. The cost for training a patient remotely. So what are your thoughts? And I know technology is great. I mean, they came to us because we're an AI company, but when it came down to actually capturing data, they ended up doing it on a phone. So.
Yeah, so I'm not a psychologist, but I'll answer with a bit of a psychological answer, because we see this all the time. The idea of patient burden and site burden, right? And for those whose videos are on, I can see some head nodding on that. We can't introduce this technology because the patients in this are at a class where trying to get them to their previous generation, trying to get them to use an iPad or an Android device is going to be a challenge. I got news for you. Many people have in my general walk of life, I've seen plenty of people who are 80 plus, and I'm not picking that number for any reason other than it's a nice age, who are using their tablets just as fine. And I've seen plenty of people who are 22 and can't figure out how to do something more basic than make a phone call off of their device. But my psychology answer to that is the human nature doesn't deal well with change, but change has to happen, right? And there has to be an investment in order for change to happen, right? So whether that investment, I think, is going to come from industry and it's going to come from the patients, right? But once that change goes through, that's going to be in the rearview mirror. Look at what's happened to COVID, right? Look how the news media, not in what they're reporting, but how they're reporting. That's an industry where reporting from home was never ever happening. You just didn't see it. And now, the big question one day I saw, and it was going around each of the media outlets, is, are you wearing pants? Right? Because people are adapting to what needs to happen. And was that change and was that move from being in the studio to being at home easy? Probably not. But you see that adoption happening. The question everyone's asking, I'm no different, is what's going to revert afterwards? Is the remote working going to kind of keep its pace, right? Or is it going to kind of revert to in office, need to have meetings, need to travel, et cetera? I don't think clinical trials are any different. And I think that, Ashish, if we can move towards adopting technology, yes, the pain is here now, but longer term, it will not be there. It simply won't be there.
Do other people have thoughts on that?
Quick thought for me. I think it's something that gets to
Hey,
both.
Matt, just say who you are and what your background is.
Sorry, hi everyone. I'm Matt Feldman, communications consultant formerly in the clinical research association space, and now a consultant and professional communicator.
And no relation. No relation
to although
there's nothing I planted here, guys. I don't want anyone to come up with any conclusions. Though I've worked with Matt professionally, we have absolutely no relationship, no familiar relationship whatsoever.
One thing that I think integrates both what Ari's saying and comments from Ashish and Terrence and Gary is that communications is often sprinkled on at the end. And it's not enough for this technology to simply build it and hope people will come, that the doctors will come, that the patients will come, that we have to more effectively communicate why it's there and what its power is, both to the regulators, to the physicians, to have communications be a central tool to be seen equally at the table along with the technology. It's self-evident to some people, but it is not self-evident to everyone. And I think that we have to invest in communications to help spark that and to help bring that along and help keep parity. It seems so often that communications is an afterthought, and I say that biased as a communications professional, but it really does. We've seen the power of just explaining some of these things. Why is e-consent here? Why is this device here? Well, it gets this and this done. I mean, it's a lot for the many of the people on this call, or most of the people on this call. Those, like I said, those things are probably self-evident, but there's a lot of people who I've found that you can bring along by just a little more effective communications and thinking of it up front rather than at the end.
I would suggest that pervades every part of healthcare too. I mean, communication is at the root of it. Van, you had a question, comment, and just introduce yourself. Oh, you're on mute. Hold on.
There we go. Sorry about that. Van Krishnamurthy, I'm an ex-Columbia physician. I was ex-Bristol Myers Squibb as well. I have an NYU-backed startup. We're creating devices for people like me who have visual impairment. Mine's from a rare disease, but the common ones obviously are age-related macular degeneration and things like diabetic retinopathy, which affect millions of people. So a few things. So part of it is because we develop ML and AI algorithms for one of our products that uses external sensors as opposed to internal sensors. So a little bit of pushback on the 80-year-old using the tablet. I will tell you, elder tech has actually become a buzzword, a hashtag now, because a lot of technology is not designed for people under the age of 30. And I can tell you, for me, even though I'm only 42, I can't read the screens of a lot of apps because of my eye disease. So just keep that in mind. I think our technology algorithms are only as good as the people designing them, and the people designing them have to be diverse enough to incorporate into design the various needs of people. And I think it is skewed more towards people who can see well, who are younger, designing products for us for obvious reasons that they're the ones hired. So that being said, my question was, is Medidata seeing CROs shift or being forced to shift how they bill? Because kind of like in healthcare, we have fee for service, right? Where doctors are billed per service. Essentially CROs bill per person and per item and per form. So it seems to me that big pharma has to force CROs to shift, I guess, to a value-based trial system if we want to share from the healthcare realm, before technology, things like remote monitoring, data monitoring, entry, all that can actually take off. And so I wanted to see if you're seeing that.
Yeah, so let me first address your comment. I apologize if it came off insensitive about the use of technology. That wasn't intended. I do fully acknowledge that it's not going to work 100% of the time, all the time, for the population as well as the given study, et cetera, right? There still is opportunity for education and awareness, and it might be like, in your case, you've mentioned, external sensors, et cetera. To me, those are all adoptions of technology to better clinical science. So does that clarify? Does that make sense? I don't disagree, Doctor, that there's a challenge there, and I don't think that the challenge is simply age-based. I think it's like you said, it's condition-based, and I don't think that I think that you're going to have young and old alike, as I was saying earlier, who might have challenges with the technology, right? I mean, there are some people who even though you tell them put it on your finger, put it on your index finger, they can't get that right? Like, it's just that simple. Your other comment about the CROs. So I do sit in an industry group with a bunch of CROs, and I think just in those conversations, as well as looking at what's being published in industry articles, yeah, the CROs have had to reinvent a little bit. And I do think that they're going to have to change their models more broadly in order to accommodate for this. I don't think this is a new topic. I know, as an example, from a CRO and technology space, we've gone to the FDA to talk about risk-based quality monitoring, topic which didn't really touch on here, but risk-based quality monitoring would also require a change in the model, right, in the billing model, because you're going to be looking at a different set of documents, and I think where you're going to shift, quite frankly, is the opportunity to shift to more volume, as opposed to like looking at 100% of data. I was just looking. I know I printed it. There was an article that was printed that was produced that I saw that came out talking about yes, the FDA will not require re-monitoring for items monitored remotely during the pandemic. So that should be an indication. So if you did remote monitoring during the pandemic, the FDA is not going to say you need to go check those patients again. So that to me would say that if CROs or sponsors alike and sites are not figuring out how to readjust, they're going to be left behind. That would be my take. Does that address your comment?
It does, yes, thanks.
So.
Hey, Ari, I have a question.
Sure.
Given the sheer...
Uh-oh.
What?
I said, uh-oh.
Given the sheer number of COVID-19 trials for vaccines and then other therapeutics, is there a danger of not having enough people enrolled in these trials in order to, get some of these vaccines, given that it seems so hard to recruit patients overall?
If you look at the latest release of the white paper that I referenced earlier, the number of clinical trials that are going on and they're pretty global for COVID, because I think now there's this race to the cure. So
Right.
I don't think this is my own personal sort of opinion. It's not based on any sort of empirical data. To the point that was made earlier, there's such awareness that clinical trials are out there that I don't know that enrollment for those trials would be nearly as challenging as enrollment for rare diseases or other places. So, and I'll use my own, again, if a year ago someone said to me, "What do you do for a living?" and I said to them, "Well, I work for a software company that provides software for clinical drug trials," people would just roll their eyes and move on because they had no clue what I was talking about. Now, when I say that, "Oh, so you must be really busy now," right? They understand that. So I think that there's much more of an awareness. And again, this has driven awareness, but I think that there's much more awareness of clinical drug trials associated with COVID, and therefore, and it's also all over the news, right? So I think people will look if they want to get involved in doing that. You see that, I think, Bunny, I've seen it with in the clinical side of plasma donations. People are donating, people who have antibodies are donating plasma because they think that, it's a good opportunity to help other folks. I would be very fascinated to see, if you look at the plasma donation statistics pre and post, I would assume that they're probably significantly higher than they've ever been.
Bunny, can I chime in?
Yeah, please.
Sure. Gary Lubin, I've been on a lot of sides of clinical trials. I was at Merck 15 years, started and ran with my colleagues, Merck Capital Ventures. We were an independent VC with one limited partner, Merck, captive fund. I started a company with the Mayo Clinic. I just started another tech company, among other things.
And we've known each other for what, like 20 some odd years?
Yes. We've seen us through a lot. So I speak with sites on a regular basis. One site in particular, a relatively high-profile, well-known site, high-performing site, is starting or has now started COVID studies for, in particular, they're looking to get as many patients as they possibly can, and they are struggling to find patients. And you would think that with all of this noise that's out there about the importance, that there would be no problem at all. There is a problem. And it further gets a little bit complicated because there are certain types of people who are more interested in clinical studies for a whole bunch of reasons we can get into later. But a very big concern is that you're going to have a sort of a skewed representation of the demographics in clinical studies, so that when you do get the data, you may not be able to apply the data across all demographics. So you have a whole another situation. But coming to the point of the topic, the question here was, you would think there wouldn't be a problem, but right now with literally hundreds of studies going on, many of them trying to run right into a phase 3 study, and they're trying to get 30,000 plus. It is very, very challenging. In other countries, it's easier, either because of the way the government is structured or their healthcare is structured. You might be able to, we will see Brazil, other countries, it'll be easier to get larger populations of people into studies, but it's a struggle in certain areas like the United States.
Why do you think that? Do you think it's because they're insisting on traditional approaches of coming into a site, or awareness? Like
different countries you're talking about? Or?
No, in the U.S.
So I think part of it is, I'll say, sort of the cultural, there is a segment of the population that will sign up in a second for study work. And it doesn't almost make a difference what it is, they will do it. There's a very large segment of our country that just simply will not enroll in studies. And then there are other segments that are, I almost say, forced into studies. For cancer, for example, there are many people who don't have too many options, and they take medications which are new that are studies because that's the way they can get treatment. And for a segment of our population, there are a number of people who don't have adequate health care, and becoming enrolled in clinical studies give them access to the healthcare system, and hence they get an opportunity to get healthcare treatments.
Interesting.
So,
Gary, sorry.
Wait. Can I?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So we technically only have 2 minutes left because we were going to have a hard stop at 1. However, I'm fine, staying on for another 5-10 minutes, whatever people want to do. Certainly, if you need to go. But just wanted to let you know. So go ahead.
Just before people drop, and I can stay on as well. I just want to have just two real quick parting comments.
Okay.
It's clear that there's a need for technology to have sustainable clinical trials. And it's clear that there's a need for patient centricity, and all of this has to happen with patient safety remaining a cornerstone, right? So we can't lose sight of that. If patient safety gets compromised, then the whole game is over. But I think realistically, and we've just talked about it briefly here, and of course I'm happy to have a conversation with anyone afterwards from this, but to me, there is absolutely a need, and there is a driving desire to have technology enablement. So I thank you all for joining today, and happy to continue the conversation.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Ari. Ashish, you want to, what you were going to ask?
Yeah, actually, I was just about to say what Gary was mentioning, that what the team who started using our platform realized was technology was not sufficient to onboard, simply because, like he mentioned, there were few people who quickly onboarded. They had the tools and say, okay, we'll go online and add the data. But the rest of them typically were able to onboard because of human relationships. Like somebody talks to them and convinces them to come on board, and then they enable all the tools. Through technology, they were not able to do it. Training was the second part, but just to talking to them, telling them, hey, you have to go online. Do you have a computer where you can do this? It was very, very challenging. The actual operations of the clinical trial was very challenging. And they're still going through that. Now they have to revamp the system in the operations for that. And it's completely not understood by the clinical trials world about technology. I mean, the patients, the physician, there are a lot more people involved as part of bringing them on board. And the resources that are required, and to add to what Dr. Van mentioned earlier was, yes, there's a lot more than just, hey, give an iPad to somebody and start capturing clinical data. No. The team has to be involved, the family has to be trained, the stakeholders around the family has to be trained in capturing data, the intermediary people, so the staff has to be trained, because now it's a whole new system. It's not just an EMR where record something and say capture. No, there's information, because they don't know what some of the technical details are, and then we had to change the language so that it's more closer to the user as opposed to closer to the CROs. And they just didn't think about all of that as capturing data. And now all of this is adding to their time and costs, and they just didn't think about it. The only part they focused on was regulatory. Will the FDA approve this? And that's it. And the operations part was completely lost. Not that we can't solve it, it's a solvable problem, but there's a education communication part which is lost completely in the whole picture.
Okay. Do you want to comment on that? Or?
I'll quickly add if I can. So thanks for shout out to me, Ashish. But to add to Ashish and Gary, a couple of things. So I'll add to another demographic that I'm sure Gary knows about is, the Black population. Many people have a very strong distrust of the healthcare community because of Tuskegee and many other things that have happened. So there's a large segment of our country who just, they don't like to be in front of a physician. They don't want to be in the health system. They're not particularly treated well when they're there. So that I'll add that. And the other part, maybe, and Ashish, I'm sure you've already thought of this, so apologies, but Cincinnati Children's, for example, when they did a study years back where they showed that AI for recruitment, the value wasn't in the recruitment step. The value was in reducing the number of records that needed to be reviewed in detail, because the AI would identify inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then it would filter through. If you had 100,000 records, you might end up with 100 records that meet the criteria. Because inclusion and exclusion criteria have exponentially grown as drug development has gotten more targeted. So I think that's where the value of the AI, and that totally, as she said, then the human aspect of it comes next. And that's where you can't replace that at this point. And I think the shift has to be, we have to talk about AI enabling that end human user and the end human employee as opposed to replacing them. I think that replacement conversation is getting everything on the wrong track.
Yeah.
I agree. It's not a replacement.
Oh.
So one comment, Bunny. Notice that the title is technology enabled, not technology replacement, because I would agree with you 1,000%. Right? We were talking about that, Bunny, right? Coming on to a title of this, and I think it's enablement, not replacement. There's no, you cannot replace the human interaction, full stop, right? That's just not possible. But the question is, when's it needed? How is it needed? Can it be done more judiciously, right? And more selected to make it work.
And just like communication, that it pervades all parts of healthcare and life with technology. So
certainly.
With that, thank you all for the diehards for staying on for such a great conversation, really exciting.